The Protestant canon. Is this the correct scriptures, or are the Orthodox and Catholic and whoever else has a different canon out there correct in saying the Protestant canon is problematic? That's what we're talking about today on the Things You Don't Hear in Church podcast. My name is Ethan.
My name is Darian, guys. If you have not, follow us on social media, like, subscribe, all that kind of stuff on YouTube. We love to see your comments on the videos. We love to respond to your comments. If you have anyone you want to have us interview or a topic you want to have us cover, we'd love to see your DM. You can either comment or message us on Instagram, hit us up on our email. We've got all that stuff, and so we love to hear from you.
Now, for today's topic, we have brought on Dan Lewis. Dan Lewis has a double master's in Western religion and philosophy. He was a pastor for 34 years. He spent time before and after being a pastor doing professorship work, was a dean of a school at one point, and now travels the world teaching in University of the Nations, teaching the Bible primarily, probably some topical stuff as well. He has a website called dkonos.org where you can read all of his commentaries and download his or read his presentations and slideshows. Just a wealth of information, decades of time spent given to ministry and learning and teaching. Dan, thank you so much for the value you've given and added to the Christian world, and thank you for coming on the podcast today. So let's get into it. The Protestant canon. Where do we start? What is the most important thing or distinction we need to know?
I think the first thing is when we use a word like canon, where the ancient word for canon really means something like a rule, not like a king ruling, but like a ruler that measures something or that keeps something aligned. And the idea of canon is those portions of writings from the ancient people of faith that are considered to be inspired by God. Therefore, they hold authority in the life of the people of God. And this would be true whether you're talking about the Old Testament canon or the New Testament canon. I think it's important to understand that you do need to treat those two differently, because the Old Testament canon is obviously earlier than the New Testament canon, and it was fixed by a somewhat little different method than you find in the New Testament canon. So I think that's the first place to start. So do you want to start with the Old Testament canon first, since that's
Let's
the
do
early?
it,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
The Hebrew Bible is an arrangement of three collections of ancient texts. The Torah, sometimes simply called the Law, or the Greek term is Pentateuch. But that would be the first 5 books. That's the first collection, the earliest collection. Then there's a second collection called the Prophets, divided into 2 sections, the former prophets and the latter prophets. The one that's called the latter prophets are pretty much what we call the prophets in English Bibles, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and so on. And then there is a third collection called the writings, the Ketubim. So you have the Torah, the Nevi'im, the Ketubim. Those 3 collections together make up the 24 books in the Hebrew Bible. Now, that might immediately strike someone as odd, because in our Old Testament, we have 39 books. But you should at least understand that this is the very same material. The reason there's a shorter number of books in the Old Testament canon is because several books are combined. There is just one book of Samuel, one book of Kings, one book of Chronicles. There is, in fact, a book called the 12, which has all 12 of the minor prophets. So Micah, Joel, Amos, and so on are all in the 12. And then you have a collection of 5 little works, which includes Ruth, the Song, Esther, and so on, that are in one little thing called the Megalot, or the 5 rolls. So by the time you account for books that were later divided, the 24 books of the Hebrew Bible and the 39 books of the English Old Testament are the same. So we start with that, okay? Those 3 divisions began being recognized at least in the 2nd century BC as more or less intact. You find one of the earliest references to them is in the book of Sirach, which is in the intertestamental literature, and it's going to mention those 3 sections. By the time you get to the New Testament, you have multiple references to the law and the prophets. That would be the first two sections of the Hebrew Bible. But on occasion, you have references to the third section. For instance, Jesus says everything in the law, the prophets, and the writings. He doesn't use the word writings, though. He uses the word psalms. The law, the prophets, and the psalms are concerning me. Well, the Psalms is the first big book in the third section. So even though he doesn't use the term ketubim, the fact that he uses the Psalms as part of what he considers to be Holy Scripture seems to imply that he's looking at the whole third section. There was a time in the late first century in which the Jewish rabbis convened to re-examine the question of canon, which they did. And while they wrestled with some issues, in the end, they did not take anything away and they did not add anything to. So the Hebrew canon remains the 24 books of the Hebrew Bible, which are the 39 books in the Old Testament. So that takes a process of time because the Torah, the early books, they were collected earlier than the other books, a little bit later than the other books, a little bit later. And you're working your way through well over 1,000 years of Hebrew history before you come to a full Old Testament canon. So does that make sense to you so far?
Yeah. One question quickly, and I don't know how much you would know about this, but do you know at what point it stopped being purely orally passed down and they actually became literature? I'm sure it's different for different books too.
Yeah, I don't think there's a point. I think it's a gradual transition. There are certainly references in the Torah to Moses writing. There are several references that Moses wrote some things down. It doesn't say he wrote all the 5 books of the Torah. That's the tradition that he did, but that's not exactly what the text says. But the text does describe Moses writing. And there are certain things that then were encoded for later generations. So the process of writing begins sometime in the lifetime of Moses himself. And I'm assuming, without getting into that issue, that Moses is a real person and that he actually did go to Mount Sinai and so on. If we get further than that, then this is no longer about canon. It's about something else.
Yeah.
Okay, so we do find that in the book of Joshua, it says that Joshua added to the books of the law. Now, we don't know exactly what he added. It doesn't tell us that, but it does tell us he added some things. So, and that seems to be referring to something in writing. By the time you get to the period of, say, David and Solomon, you have a somewhat uptick in literacy because David will be the first of the monarchs to actually have a scribe on his royal cabinet, I guess you could call them, his surrounding circle of supporters. So as a scribe, and that by definition, someone who reads and writes. However, the big surge came in the 8th century BC. And that largely was due to the Assyrian Empire and its establishment of libraries in all of the major cities of its empire. That in turn upped the issue of literacy. And so now you're beginning to have more and more written text and not just oral transmissions. So for instance, when you talk about a prophet like Elijah or Elisha, they don't write anything. But when you get to the 8th century, you have Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, Micah, all of them writing down their sermons. Later, Jeremiah in the 7th century. Zephaniah in the 7th century, and on to Ezekiel in the 6th century, and so on. So the process of writing things down, encoding things, is a process that is to some degree shaped by the literacy of the times. And literacy takes a big jump upward in the 8th century BC. So by the time you get to the period of the exile and following the exile, within that period of time, all of the ancient works have now been encoded. We don't always know by whom. For instance, take the Book of Kings, which in the Hebrew Bible is just one book. We've divided it into 1st and 2nd, but in that Book of Kings, there are several references to the archives of the kings of Israel and the archives of the kings of Judah. Those are written texts that pre-existed prior to the writing of First and Second Kings. And it's obvious from the way that it's mentioned that whoever wrote First and Second Kings, they are using those earlier materials to compile a history of the nation of Israel. So this is a process of time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely makes sense.
You might even wonder how the southern nation that went into exile got a hold of the archives of the kings of the north.
Yeah, I thought that.
They weren't all that friendly most of their existence. But I think while we don't know for sure, the most likely possibility is that refugees that fled from the north to Jerusalem during the time of Hezekiah probably brought with them copies of the archives or texts that they had in the northern kingdom. And so they became accessible to writers in the south.
Makes sense.
Okay. Now, okay, go ahead. Yeah, another question.
I was just going to say, is there an established time that you know of where the Old Testament canon, the three different parts, are officially put together in writing, like an earliest time? I know you mentioned like around the 2nd century BC.
Yeah, that's the earliest reference we have is in Sirach to the three parts together.
Okay.
Now, whether they pre-existed earlier than that, I would say likely they did, but we don't have any references to that. And there's certainly no period where a bunch of highbrow rabbis got together and did this on Thursday afternoon somewhere. This is a gradual process. But by the time you get to the New Testament, there seems to be clear references and voluminous references to these texts. In fact, one of the favorite expressions of Jesus, later followed by Paul, is the expression, "It is written." And when Jesus says it is written, he is not talking about oral tradition. He's talking about a text, and that text is recognized and accepted.
Do you know anything about what in the Jewish mind canonization would mean to them and how it might differ to us? So for the Old Testament canon, how they would see it, 2nd century, it's starting to come together, and what would that mean to them that it is written? Does that make sense?
First of all, it would mean that this would be regularly read publicly in the synagogues. So the synagogues begin sometime in the intertestamental period, but a major part of the liturgical service in the synagogue was the reading of the text. So there was usually a reading of something from the Torah, and usually something from the prophets, and sometimes something from the Psalms. These were read publicly because even though literacy was increased, still the major part of the population was not literate. They needed to go to synagogue to hear the text read so that they would know what it said. And so that in itself is one of the major steps toward canonization. Was it actually used in the synagogue and read as the word of God? And it was.
And then when Jesus says, these concerning me, and he's referencing those three parts of the Torah, would that, if we can get a little bit into like the distinction between the Protestant, if we're there, we can finish up if we're not and get there later, but the distinction between like the Protestant canon and the Orthodox Catholic canon, I think they have different canons themselves.
They do. Yeah, some of them do.
Yeah, so when Jesus says these pertaining to me, is he referencing like stuff in the Deuterocanonical, or is it mainly just what the Protestants have, and maybe that's evidence for a Protestant Old Testament?
If we knew that for sure, the question would be over. We don't know that for sure. Here's what we know. In the mid-3rd century BC, there was a Syrian Greek ruler in Alexandria, Egypt, that had this vision of creating a major international library. And in fact, he managed to do that. He wanted all of the major literary works in the world to be available in Greek, course, he is himself Greek speaking, and he's part of the residual of Alexander's empire. So that included the Hebrew Bible. So according to the tradition, sometime around 250 BC, work began on translating the Hebrew Bible into Greek. That took quite a number of years. Traditionally, there's 70 scholars involved. There's a little bit of question about whether that is an accurate number, a mathematical number, or maybe a symbolic number. But in any case, they did do this. And when they had completed the Old Testament Bible, or the Hebrew Bible, into Greek, then they included within it a number of works that were already in Greek that were written in the intertestamental period. But that will be later than the original translation process. But in the end, you're going to get what is called the Septuagint, which is the Hebrew Bible in Greek plus the intertestamental books. And that will include 1st and 2nd Maccabees, Sirach, the Wisdom of Solomon, Judith, Tobit, all of those different kinds of works. So by the time you get to the 1st century AD, there are Jews scattered throughout the world called the diaspora. Most of those diaspora synagogues are Greek speaking. And they're going to be reading their ancient texts in the synagogues in Greek, and that will include both what was once the Hebrew Bible, now translated into Greek, as well as those intertestamental books. So when you are in a synagogue in Judea, for instance, which now is still reading the text in Hebrew, it's a little less clear how they were managing that. They certainly were reading the text in Hebrew and eventually in Aramaic, but we don't have really easy answers as to what they were doing with those other books. But at least in the diaspora, there's pretty clear evidence that all of those texts were being read.
So you're saying that some would be reading in Hebrew and not including those other books, and some would be reading in Hebrew.
Yes.
I got you.
Wow.
Or at least we don't know how they were reading them in Hebrew.
So this has been a topic of debate since before the church founded. Even probably Jews.
Absolutely. Yes. This doesn't start with Christians. It starts earlier than Christians.
Wow. Okay.
However,
easy topic to handle in an hour podcast. No problem.
Sure. Very, very quickly, Paul and some of the other apostles are going to be stretching the boundaries of who belongs to the people of God. And so they're reaching out beyond the Jewish circle to Gentiles and saying they also can belong to the people of God. And in those areas that they evangelize, which includes Asia Minor, it includes Italy, it includes Greece, everywhere they are using the Septuagint as their basic Bible. And that would include not only the Hebrew Bible translated into Greek, but also the other books. Not often, but on rare occasions, the New Testament actually quotes from some of these books. Sure. James, for instance, quotes from them. Paul, in the 2nd chapter of Romans, quotes from some of them. And a couple of other places, he also quotes from them. So it would seem to me you don't quote from things you haven't been reading.
Right.
If he's quoting from them, he at least assumes that his audience has some sense of what he's talking about. Now, that doesn't entirely answer the question of canon, but it does at least mean that the early Christians were reading these books and they were reading them in their church services. That seems to be pretty clear. So when you come to the issue of what is canonical or not, which for many Christians boils down to what can you use to establish the theology of the church.
Right.
That's where you get a little dicey. Among the early church fathers, for instance, they didn't all agree on that. Jerome, who translated the Vulgate, did not accept using the intertestamental books as the basis for theology. He did translate them in the Latin, and they are in the Vulgate. But on the other hand, he was doubtful whether they should be used as a text for establishing the theology of the church. On the other hand, other church fathers disagreed with him. Chrysostom, for instance, he would read all of them and use them all as a basis for theology. So there was some ambivalence, I guess you might say, in those early centuries about what to do with these intertestamental books. But they continue to be used in the churches. And in the Latin Vulgate, they continue to be read for the next 1,000 years in the Christian churches. It's not until you get to the Protestant Reformation that you have sort of a revisiting of this issue and some official kinds of declarations made. Luther is going to translate the intertestamental books into German, just as he did the Hebrew Bible. But he's going to include them in a section between the Old Testament and the New Testament and label them as books worthy to be read, but not books used to establish the theology of the church. So this begins a process in Protestantism where the Hebrew Bible is canonical, but the intertestamental books are not, even though they are worth reading and are worth using for strengthening and good stories, edification, spiritual wisdom, that sort of thing, but not for establishing doctrine. So that tended to be followed by the Protestants from Luther's time on. Calvin would take more or less the same position. The other churches, Anglican Church, for instance, will arrive at the same position, and so on. So in response to that, the Roman Catholic Church at the Council of Trent declared these books to be deuterocanonical, which means second canon. And so they are going to accept them as useful for establishing theology. That division between canons has continued ever since. So I think both sides are, at least in my historical perspective, both sides try to, I want to say, overcook the issue a little bit. I think the Catholic Church would like to say they have always been canonical. That's, and I know they give proofs for that. They go back into the history of the early church and try to find supporting arguments. But in my review of those historical statements, they're not quite as clear as the Catholic Church would like it to be. On the other hand, Protestants, some of them have reacted so severely against the Apocrypha that they don't read it at all. And that largely is due to the Puritans. The Puritans are the ones that took such a very negative stance against the Apocrypha. But the Reformers did not take that negative a stance. So they still read them, used them, and translated them. So Protestants say that the Apocrypha was never, ever considered to be useful. We shouldn't read it at all. That's way, way beyond the bounds. That's just not true. Historically, that's simply not true. It falls somewhere there in the middle, and there is a little bit of fuzziness there. But I guess as I'm an Anglican, by the way, although I came to it somewhat late in life, but their position that the Hebrew Bible is used for establishing theology and the apocryphal books are worthy to be read, even in church. At least I'm comfortable with that. At least they read them. And if I go further than that, I'm stepping outside the boundaries of real historical substance. So that's a long monologue. I'm sorry about that.
No, I love that. That's amazing. Ethan, I'm sure you have questions. I'm gonna ask one question really quick. About, oh, now I just forgot it. Hold on. How important of a question is this? Because like you said, a lot of Protestants, at least a lot of evangelical Protestants, the circle that me and Ethan grew up in, this is like you're not a Christian kind of question for them. Of like, oh, you add books to the Bible, you're not a Christian anymore. But in the broader scheme of history and tradition, even within Protestant circles, depending on which one you're in, like you said, it's not a big deal. Like, it's not, I mean, it is a big deal for some people, but it's not a deal of like salvation or being labeled a Christian. It's a secondary issue you can disagree on. In your mind, how big of an issue is this? People listening to the episode, maybe they're freaking out hearing this information for the first time. How should people react when dealing with this question?
I think it's a secondary issue, not a central issue. All branches of Christianity agree on the canonical status of the Hebrew Bible. Both the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church mostly agree on the intertestamental books that they consider to be canonical, although the two canons of the Roman Church and the Eastern Church are slightly different. They have most of the same books, but they're not identical all the way through. And Protestants have tended to take the position, at least from the Reformers, that they are worth reading. They have spiritual value. And then there are the more radical Protestants that say they shouldn't be read at all. So I am not in that radical point of view, and I think this is a secondary issue. I can have Christian fellowship with any Christian that holds the center of the classical Christian faith. And that center primarily is enunciated in the ancient statements of faith of the church, like the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed or the Chalcedonian Confession or things like that. Christians all over can agree on that, and that becomes the center. If everything is in the center, then I can get along with no one who's not just exactly like me. And if you pardon me saying so, that's a pretty arrogant point of view, that I'm the benchmark for the world.
Yeah,
I'm not the benchmark for the world. Christ is the benchmark for the world, and this issue is secondary. So I think it's really important that Christians differentiate between central issues and secondary issues.
Okay. For maybe someone who's in the more radical camp, grew up like me and Ethan has, and they're questioning this for the first time. They've never read these books before. Probably haven't even heard of half of them, right? They've maybe vaguely heard of Enoch once. Or
Enoch is not one of them.
Sure. But I mean,
belongs to the intertestamental Apocrypha. It belongs to the Pseudepigrapha. That's a different altogether.
Yes. But as extra books, like that's the only thing they've heard of before.
Sure. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That's the only thing that comes into their mind because they listened to Heiser once or something like that. So like this is all
taking that position.
Sure. But he references Enoch.
He does.
So it's, I know a lot of evangelicals who really like Heiser, and so they've like that's the only exposure they've had to it before. Can you give people a little bit of an overview of like the contents of these books? Because I feel like for a lot of people, they're thinking like it's just witchcraft and black magic in there, and they have no idea what's going on. It just seems like evil to them. What kind of things are going on in those books? Does it contradict the rest of Scripture? Stuff like that. You don't need to go to like the contents of every book, but
let me start with Jesus.
Cool.
Jesus went to Jerusalem for the Feast of Hanukkah. In your New Testament, it's usually called the Feast of Dedication, but it is the festival that Jews still celebrate, is the festival of Hanukkah. Hanukkah, or dedication, is a celebration of the reconsecration of the temple that's found in 1st and 2nd Maccabees. It's not in the Old Testament. It is in the intertestamental books. And in 1st and 2nd Maccabees, there is the story of how the Jews revolted against the pagan Greeks, won back the independence of the city of Jerusalem, and cleansed the temple. And that cleansing of the temple is celebrated every year since as the festival of Hanukkah. Jesus went to Jerusalem for the festival of Hanukkah.
Wow.
At the very least, that should tell somebody that Jesus wasn't anti-1st and 2nd Maccabees.
Sure.
I mean, he couldn't have been. He wouldn't have gone otherwise. So I think that's maybe a window into some of these texts. There are different kinds of texts. 1st and 2nd Maccabees are largely about the history of the wars of the Jews and the Greeks. Something like the book of Sirach is much more similar to the book of Proverbs. It's basically wisdom literature. You have stories like the book of Tobit, in which Tobit takes a trip to try to find some funds or sources to help his father who had gone blind. And along the trip, he is joined by a companion who turns out to be the angel Raphael. He didn't know that at the time, but that's who it turns out to be. And it's basically a story about that. In the end, his father is cured of his blindness. And just as a footnote, it's the only book that has a pet dog. There's no book in the Old Testament where there's a pet dog, but there is a pet dog in it. I don't know if that makes it any more spiritual than some other book. It's just kind of
might mean some people.
Sure. So you have a variety of kinds of literature. You have historical literature. You have kind of legendary literature like heroes and that sort of thing. You have wisdom literature. That's what you have in the intertestamental works. I don't know that I think earlier Ethan might have mentioned my website. I have an introduction to each of the apocryphal books and a summary of their basic contents. And you can find it on my website, which is www.dkonos.org. So that's one place you can find an easy reference to get kind of a handle on what these books are about. If you want to read them, they are published in the Revised Standard Version of the Bible with Apocrypha and the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible with Apocrypha. They're published in any of the Roman Catholic translations, which would include the NAB, the Jerusalem Bible, the old Dewey Rams version. They'll be in all of those. And they will be in 2 or 3 other modern translations. So they're pretty easy to get a hold of.
Okay.
Oxford University actually publishes a book just of the Apocrypha. So you can get one slim volume that has all of them in it.
Is there anything in the Apocrypha, so these intertestamental books, that maybe people would be suspect of, like that they would read and be like, oh, that doesn't fit my theology necessarily, or they would be worried about?
Yeah, there are. There are a couple of legendary stories. The one I'm going to point out is the book of Judith, which if you read it as a history, straight out history, it's just got flat out bad mistakes. I mean, it mixes up the emperors and the Persian and the Greek empires, and it gets them in the wrong order and in the wrong time. On the other hand, if you read it as, I guess what I would call uplifting fiction, then that's less of a problem. It depends on what you're doing with it. But that would immediately be a problem for someone who was looking at a book like that as if it were historical, but it's got some pretty egregious historical lapses. Another thing might be some theological ideas. For instance, when Judas Maccabeus in his wars with the Greeks discovered several of his soldiers had been killed, and when they were getting them ready for burial, they discovered that they had around their necks a cord with a talisman, like a charm. Well, that's a carved emblem of some kind, and it seems to be in violation of the second commandment. And so Judas Maccabeus asked his soldiers to pray for these deceased soldiers. Probably most Protestant Christians have a pretty dim idea about praying for the dead. They have this idea, when you're dead, that's it. Okay, you know, whatever happens is in God's hands, but you can't affect that. So that would be something that would raise some eyebrows. So there's a few things like that. In my opinion, those things don't cancel out everything else, but they are things that would raise some eyebrows.
Sure.
With the I forget which book you just said, I missed the name, but the one that had some historical lapses where it got some emperors.
That's a book of Judith.
Judith.
Book of Judith.
So
it's a story about a very lovely lady who sneaks into the enemy camp, apparently to seduce the enemy general. But when he goes to sleep, she cuts off his head and delivers the people of Israel from this foreign pagan power. So
Mm.
that's a very, very short
Okay.
sketch.
And
But that's
so does this book set out, because my question would be like, does this book set out to be a historical narrative genre? Because I think
well,
someone
that's
could then say like, oh, if this is supposed to be history and it's clearly wrong, it's unreliable, we can reject it.
that's the big question.
Mm-hmm.
There is such a thing as uplifting fiction that we don't think is historical, but it is still valuable. And so many people would say this book doesn't attempt to be historical.
Mm-hmm.
It uses what appears to be the setting of history, but that is more window dressing. And the real story is whether or not you trust in God to save you when you're faced with overwhelming opposition. And that's a question we don't really know for sure how to answer. So some would say, yes, it's intended to be history, therefore it's bad, throw it out. Others would say, no, not necessarily. It may not be intended to be history, but it is intended to be strengthening to your faith. As an example, let me, for instance, talk a moment about the parables of Jesus. They seem to be fictional stories. When he says a sower went out to sow and he sowed seed in the different kinds of soil, he's not talking about, Bob over here, some actual farmer.
Right.
He's just using an illustration of a story. It's a fictional story.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean we throw it out because it's fictional? I don't think so. I think it has a true meaning, and Jesus explains that meaning. So fiction itself doesn't necessarily mean something is automatically rejected. Only if it's attempting to say something is historical and it's not, would that be true? So it's a little more complicated question than maybe some people have thought.
Yeah. Well, one thing that really surprises me is hearing you say that in John, when Jesus is celebrating the Feast of Dedication, that's a Hanukkah setting. This is the first time in my whole Christian life I'm hearing that. And so you would think that,
don't hear it from the side of people that want to get rid of the internet books.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Like, if you're thinking about like all the times churches have gone through the book of John, we just see the Feast of Dedication and I just like move on like, oh yeah, there's a Feast of Dedication. I've never thought, what was that feast? Maybe if I did an SBS and I was a good inductive student, I would have asked that question. But in my BCC, we didn't cover that. So there we go. That's my excuse. Yeah. Anyways, that's a insider YWAM joke for the listeners there.
And you don't have to take my word for it. You can look it up in any biblical dictionary or encyclopedia, International Standard Bible Encyclopedia, for instance, anything like that. I mean, and those are all written by Protestants.
Yeah.
I tell you that, though.
And so it seems like, wow, this is like Jesus was celebrating Hanukkah. That might put a lot of weight in the camp of like we should have some positive feelings towards this group of books. And then the question, I guess, would be like, how does one begin to interact with that? Like, are we supposed to incorporate it into our quiet time? And as like I'm reading through the Old Testament and then I start reading through the Apocrypha and then I read through the New Testament? Or how does one even just start to engage with this text? Because it does seem, even like right now, like I would like in theory be like, yeah, I have no problem with the text. It doesn't matter. Like if someone wants to accept them, I'm like, sure. I would probably side with Jerome where you can't build doctrine off of it just because I haven't read them. But I still haven't read them. So I have like no problem people reading them. I haven't read them. So where do I go from here where I'm like, okay, how do I start to interact with these in a realistic way?
I would recommend that someone starts simply by reading one of them. And I would recommend Sirach because it's very similar to Proverbs. It has the same kind of wisdom sayings and so on. So it might be a good place to start. Let me share an anecdote from the life of John Bunyan, who was definitely a Protestant. He was in the Bedford jail because he was preaching without a license from the Anglican Church. He was in jail for like 10 or 12 years, a long time.
Whoa.
Which is, of course, he wrote and was famous for writing Pilgrim's Progress, which until just the last few decades was the most widely read book in English literature outside the Bible. Everybody read Pilgrim's Progress. Almost everybody
Right.
had a copy of it in their shelf at home. But anyway, while he was in the Bedford jail, Mr. Bunyan was very encouraged by a phrase that he remembered from his childhood. And this phrase was, "Whoever trusted in the Lord and the Lord ever failed him." And he was really encouraged by that. And he kept asking his people that would come and visit him in jail, "Where is this passage? I remember it from when I was a child. It's been really a great encouragement to me, but I can't find it." So they're looking in the Old Testament and looking in the prophets and looking in the Proverbs, and they can't find this passage until finally somebody discovered where it was. It was in the Apocrypha. And he heard it read probably when he was a boy going to an Anglican church.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they told John Bunyan, "This is in the Apocrypha." He said, "Well, it was an encouragement to me," which is a good answer, because it was an encouragement to it. So I don't know. That's just a little anecdote, but it comes back from, 200 or 300 years ago, and by someone whom most Protestants respect as pretty much a card-carrying Protestant. But it was a great encouragement just to hear those words. Whoever trusted in the Lord and the Lord ever failed him.
Yeah. And then one thing, this is the answer to this is probably no, because so many Christians accept it. But I'd wonder, are there anything, obviously, like maybe you don't have the whole thing memorized, but maybe you do. You've been in ministry for a long time. But, is there any major contradictory things to the rest of Scripture where that would bat some eyes, where you're like, oh, how do we accept that? And how do we, what do we do there?
Yeah. Well, I don't really find anything that contradicts things in the New Testament. I find some things that occasionally are maybe a little different than I would find in the New Testament, and maybe a different point of view of this or that, but I don't really find them in loggerheads or in contradiction to each other.
Yeah, so there's nothing if you start reading it, you're going to be like, wait, that's not the Bible literally says the opposite.
Yeah, well, there certainly are, in any kind of literature, there's going to be some of those kinds of issues. You have those kind of issues in the New Testament without the Apocrypha at all. You've got Paul saying you're saved by grace through faith and not by works. And you have James saying you've got to have works or your faith can't be examined, and it almost sounds like they're talking about the opposite sorts of things.
Right.
Paul says you're justified by faith. James says you're justified by works. If you just extract those two phrases from those two writers side by side, it looks like a flat out contradiction. I don't think Paul and James are in contradiction. I think you only make them in contradiction when you isolate those phrases out of their larger context.
Right.
In their larger context, in fact, they are saying the same thing.
Yeah, I was doing a study on James about that, and like in the same verse or in the same little couple verses, James says, so like we're talking about Abraham, it says, so you see his faith was completed by his works, and you're like,
yeah,
oh, that kind of answers the question, like,
yeah, sure.
Works complete your faith. That's why he's like, that's why you need him.
All I'm warning against is those who might find some phrase in the Apocrypha that they think is in conflict with some phrase somewhere in the New Testament. And I would just simply encourage people to read them in a larger context. And often that what appears to be at face value, at least a contradiction, in fact, might melt away pretty quickly.
Love it.
That's good.
Before we move on to more questions about these books, can you, for people who are grew up without knowing any of these books, and like I said, all they've heard of is like the Book of Enoch, can you tell us the difference really quick between the Apocrypha with the intertestamental books and the pseudepigraphal books?
Yeah. There, besides the Hebrew Bible and the Apocrypha, there is one other collection of Jewish writings that is called the pseudepigrapha. Now, these are all apocalyptic style works. So sometimes it simply goes by the title, at least among scholars, as Jewish apocalyptic. So that will include things like 1st Enoch, 2nd Enoch, 3rd Enoch, 4th Enoch, as well as the Testament of Moses, 2nd Baruch, the letter of Elijah. There's a bunch of books there, probably 20 or 25. I Would have to count them to see how many, but quite a number of books there. Now, the Jews read those books as well, but they didn't give them the same amount of status or weight as you would find in the Apocrypha or the Hebrew Bible. So they are important because they help us understand the development of certain ideas within the Jewish community. And some of those ideas you find in the New Testament. So, for instance, you will find in the New Testament words like Belial as a title for Satan. Where does that come from? Well, it comes from not the Apocrypha, but comes from the Pseudepigrapha. You find the images of Sheol as being a place of flames and fire and so on. Where does that come from? That comes from the Pseudepigrapha. It doesn't come from the Apocrypha. It doesn't come from the Hebrew Bible. So even though the Pseudepigrapha is by no one considered to be canonical, Jews, Roman Catholics, Orthodox, Protestants, none of them consider it canonical. They are important for historical reasons and to understand how certain kinds of ideas and vocabulary come about that you find in the New Testament.
Love it. So for people, if we're going to move now from that section to the New Testament, when does the New Testament canon get put together? If we're comparing Old Testament canon versus New Testament canon, is there different books there, or is it only in the Old Testament that you see the different books?
Well, you do have a process in the New Testament as well. It doesn't happen immediately. What you have, the earliest kind of reference you have is actually in one of the letters of Peter, where he talks about the letters of Paul and sets them alongside what he calls the other scriptures. So by making that analogy, it appears that Peter, fairly early in the Christian church, is considering the writings of Paul to be canonical in some sense, because he advises them to be read just like the other scriptures are read. However, the collections of letters in the New Testament isn't uniform. For instance, in the early couple of first centuries or so of the Christian church, the four Gospels circulated as a unit, but not attached to the letters of Paul and not attached to other things. The letters of Paul circulated as a unit. So we find collections of, say, 10 letters of Paul, maybe 7 letters of Paul, some all 13 with his name on it. But we have the letters of Paul circulating as a group and the Gospels circulating as a group. A given congregation, it would take time for them to actually receive copies of all the various documents in the New Testament. The copying process is slow. The distribution process is slow. So let's suppose you lived in, let's say, around 100 AD. You might have 1 or 2 Gospels. You might have 2 or 3 letters of Paul. You might have 2 or 3 other documents, and that's what you have. 10 years later, you might have a little bit more. So it goes through a process of time. So what you have in the early writings of the earliest Christians is you have different lists of books that are considered canonical. The earliest lists are shorter, and they add more books as you go further down the line and circulation becomes wider. But you don't have an absolute full list of the 27 books in the New Testament until 360, I believe, 7 AD by Athanasius in his 39th Easter letter. Wow. That is the earliest list of the New Testament. All 27 books, no extra ones added, no ones left out. Earlier than that, you have about a half a dozen works that don't appear in many of the early lists. We don't know why they don't appear. Doesn't necessarily mean people thought they were bad. It might only mean that they just hadn't circulated very much, because these are the short ones in the New Testament. 2 John, 3 John, Jude, 2 Peter. These are all relatively short. So you have some early lists of New Testament works that don't include those books. When you get to a writer like the great church historian who wrote the history of the Christian church, Eusebius, I don't know if you're familiar with his name, but he actually divides the Christian writings into kind of three categories. Those that are accepted by all, and that will be pretty close to 20 books, more or less. We include all the Gospels, the letters of Paul, the book of Acts, and all those are there. Then there is what he calls works that are disputed, accepted by some, but not fully accepted by others. Those will be those books like 2nd John, 3rd John, Jude, and so on, those little short ones. And then he has a list of books that are not accepted by anybody. And that would be the Gnostic literature, things that are way off out in the left field somewhere. So he divides the text into those kinds of categories. And I think that's helpful because it shows this process as it is kind of happening in the New Testament church. Let me give you an example. In around 340-ish, Constantine ordered that 100 new copies of the Bible be produced in large format. These would be the kind that would be on display in a church and you would use it for public reading, that sort of thing. By that time, Christianity is no longer illegal, so they're not risking destruction if they produce these big Bibles. So he ordered 100 of them to be produced. One of what might be one of the 100 is called Codex Sinaiticus. We don't know that for sure, but it's the right size and it's from the right time. That's about as close as we can get for sure. But the interesting thing is that it is today the oldest complete Bible in existence. It's in the British Library in London. But oddly enough, it includes all the books of the Apocrypha and 2 extra books in the New Testament. Shepherd of Hermas and the Epistle of Barnabas, neither of which make it to the final listing. So I don't know how much that particular text was reproduced, but it is the oldest Bible that we have that has all of the Hebrew Bible, all of the New Testament, and also the Apocrypha, and also a couple of extra Christian works. So this is kind of an interesting feature. I'm very familiar with this text. In fact, I just took a group of students through the British Library about a week and a half ago to see this text, as well as a number of other texts that are similar to that. So we talked a lot about, the kinds of things I've just mentioned.
Wow.
So when it comes to the 2 extra books of the Shepherd of Hermas,
I'm just curious, real quick. I just want to ask Dan something real quick. Did you see anything about a year and a half ago about Codex Sinaiticus and the debate between Wes Huff and a Gnostic guy who was claiming the Gnostic always claimed the Sinai Bible, and he always was referencing the Sinaiticus, Codex Sinaiticus. Have you heard about this?
No, but I don't do podcasts.
Okay, maybe I'll send you the debate, but it's quite entertaining.
So for better or worse, that's what I've heard of Wes Huff. I at least know his name. And I don't know what the Gnostic guy was saying, but there's no Gnostic literature in Sinaiticus.
Yeah, that's he got destroyed in the debate. But I can
so
send it to you.
He's wrong. I can tell you that without even knowing.
I love it.
That's fine. Yeah. All right, Derek, what were you gonna say?
Yeah. So when it comes to these 2 extra books that it has in its New Testament, the Shepherd of Hermas, and then a Gospel, you said,
Epistle of Barnabas.
Epistle of Barnabas. I'm sorry.
Letter of Barnabas. Yeah.
So I've heard of the Shepherd of Hermas before, and read part of it, and I've heard that it was also read in church for a while, like similar to how Protestants view the Apocrypha. Do you know anything about both those books, and can you tell us a little more?
Well, I've read them both, as well as a lot of other new literature produced by early Christians. The Shepherd of Hermas is kind of an allegorical story. And so if you're going to read it, you're going to have to read it differently than you read the New York Times or something like that, because it's basically allegorical. And it's got some really unusual passages you're not quite sure what to do with, because they're quite mystical. And so I don't know what to say about the Shepherd of Hermas other than that it is an unusual book. The Epistle of Barnabas is a little more down to earth, other than that it predicts the end of the world in about 500 years, which obviously didn't happen because here we are. And it belongs along with a number of other works that are called the Apostolic Fathers. So there's 8 or 10 of those works that were written by early Christians. Some of those are very early. Probably the two earliest will be a work called the Didache, which is a Greek word that means the teaching, and then what is called First Clement. Both of them probably written before the end of the first century. So they're written really around the time of the book of Revelation. They're very, very early. So, for instance, in the Didache, this will be the earliest text outside the Bible that says when you baptize people, you should baptize them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. The Didache also gives some instructions for celebrating the Eucharist, prayers that you should pray for the Eucharist, and some advice about traveling missionaries. If traveling missionaries show up at your church and ask for money, they're frauds. Kick them out. If they stay longer than 3 days, they're probably frauds. Kick them out.
Wow.
Which is just really interesting because very early then, I mean, by the end of the first century, you're having churches having to deal with issues we're still dealing with. We still deal with that sort of thing in the 21st century. So that's just kind of interesting. So those are it also includes the Epistle of Polycarp, the 7 letters of Ignatius, when he's on his way to execution in Rome, the martyrdom of Polycarp, those kind of works.
Yeah, I love it.
These are never considered scripture, but they are considered very valuable by early Christians.
I love that. I've read the Didache myself. It was great. One last question, for me at least. I think when a lot of evangelical Protestants are hearing a lot of this information for the first time, they can think, especially because there's so much online buzz right now about Catholicism and Orthodoxy and people just changing traditions. They're very popular right now.
Sure.
And high church, I guess, in general.
I think people are looking for roots.
Yeah. I'm not saying it's bad at all. But a lot of people will hear this information and be like, oh, like I have to become Catholic. I have to become Orthodox. Like it seems like there's so much evidence for these extra books. And especially when they start to think about, oh, like the Bible wasn't formed like immediately, like it's put together over time and we don't have this list until later on. And there can be some panic that kind of goes on. And at least some more very fundamentalist people who haven't gone through a lot of this before. Can you give people some perspective about that kind of a question though? Like, do you have to just automatically become Catholic from this? How do you calm people's worries about the Bible and what it is, all that kind of stuff?
Well, from my own point of view, I am not, first of all, a Protestant or an evangelical or a Catholic or an Orthodox. I am, first of all, a Christian. Everything else comes below that. I happen to be a Protestant Christian. I happen to be an evangelical. I happen to be a biblical scholar, but I'm first of all a Christian. And I don't see anything in the New Testament at all that suggests that God worries about the sign in front of your church. He does examine your heart. And the Lord knows who are his. That is a direct quote from St. Paul. The Lord knows who are his. So that means I need to reserve some judgment. I need to have a little bit of theological humility and realize that I am a limited human being. I don't have all of the answers, but I am also fully devoted to Jesus Christ as the Son of God, born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, and on the third day resurrected from the dead, who sits at the right hand of the Father, Those kind of things are my center. Oddly enough, that would be true whether I was Protestant, Catholic, or Orthodox. That's still the center. So I guess I don't think you need to change churches, but I do think you need to have a good sense of where the center is and not make secondary issues the center. And I think particularly within much of very fundamentalist Protestantism, a lot of things have crept into the center that are probably not, don't really belong in the center. Give you an example. When I was a professor at William Tyndale College for a number of years as a lounge, student lounge, they have a bulletin board in there, had one that either businesses or churches could post things for, they need a Christian education director, or they need somebody out of the psychology department in this business issue or something. But I was rolling through there one day and I stopped to look at a posting from a church in southwestern Detroit that was looking for a new music director in their church. The very first qualification for the music director was they had to believe in a pre-tribulation rapture.
First qualification.
I started laughing. I thought, this is going to be a joke, but this wasn't a joke. If I were hiring a music director, and I've been a pastor and hired music directors, I don't think I want to know, can you play the piano or sing or do something musically? But what you believe about the rapture, that's about the last thing I worry about in my music director. So, but I think we often have moved into the center a number of issues that probably don't belong there. So I think that's my last bit of wisdom is take a good look at what is in the center and be sure you can distinguish between what belongs in the center and what is a secondary issue.
That's awesome. That's very helpful, very pastoral and very, I think clarifying.
There's a famous saying, goes back several centuries actually, and we had it embossed in the glass panels of the doors of our church that says, in essentials, unity; in doubtful matters, liberty; in all things, charity. I think that's a good philosophy.
Beautiful.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
All right. Well, as far as the Protestant canon goes, guys, you can read the Deuterocanonical text, it seems. Not building doctrines, but edifying the soul seems to be a pretty fair historic position on it. So don't get overwhelmed when your Catholic friends talk about it. Maybe even engaging with them about it. And maybe it'd be edifying to our souls. Dan, thanks for coming on and sharing with us about the Protestant canon. And guys, next week we're having Dan on again. We're going to be talking about women in ministry. And so that's going to be a great conversation, looking at the scriptures, looking at church history. And so tune in for that, subscribe, and go follow his website again. That's dkonos.org, dkonos.org. I reference it probably on average maybe a couple times a month in prep for different various things, and it's very helpful. And Dan, I do have to confess, I have had
9,000 logins a week.
Wow. I will say, Dan, I have had to download the PDFs to my computer so I can highlight the PDF and remember things.
Yeah.
I have not distributed it, so I'm not breaking any laws. I just wanted to let you know. And also, if I'm on an airplane, right? If I was on an airplane, I wanted to read them, so downloaded them. And
well, I'm with you. I like paper. I'm still. I mean, I do stuff online, when I need to, but I still prefer paper.
Yes.
Probably never get out of that,
Right.
I'm too old soon, too late smart, I guess.
All right. Well, we will see you guys next week, and you guys have a great week. Peace.
Shoots.